In the late 1930s, as the Atlantic grew restless with whispers of war, France dreamed of a new queen to command the South Atlantic, defying distance and rivals alike. The ambition burned brightest in the shipyards of Saint Nazaire. Here, amid the clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches, the nation sought to reclaim maritime glory lost since the days of the Normandy. This was no ordinary vessel. She would be named Pasteur, after the scientist whose discoveries had saved countless lives, a symbol of French intellect, elegance, and resilience. The goal was clear, to link Bordeaux and Buenos Aires with unmatched speed and sophistication, carrying mail, immigrants, and the elite across 21 days of ocean in comfort that rivaled the finest hotels of Paris. The vision belonged to the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, the storied French line. They had watched German liners like the Cap Arcona and Italian ships like the Augustus dominate the South American trade. France refused to concede. The Pasteur would sail at a sustained 23 knots, powered by advanced machinery, her hull shaped to part the long southern swells with grace. Designers sketched a profile of quiet power, a single tall funnel raked aft, a cruiser stern, and a gentle sheer that promised stability even in the roaring 40s. Passengers would step aboard not onto a mere ship, but into a floating extension of the Champs-Élysées. In the shipyard, the human pulse of the project beat strongest. Riveters worked 12-hour shifts, their hands blackened with tar and oil. Welders shielded their eyes against brilliant arcs of light. Women in headscarves carried rivets in canvas bags, while foremen shouted orders over the din. Everyone knew this liner carried national pride. A young apprentice later recalled the moment the keel was laid in 1937, the slow, deliberate lowering of the first massive plate, the cheer that rose when it settled into place. It felt, he wrote in a letter home, as though France herself had taken her first breath again. Technically, the gamble was bold. The hull would stretch 212.4 meters overall, with a beam of 26.8 meters, displacing nearly 30,000 gross registered tons when fully loaded. 4 Parsons steam turbines would deliver 50,000 shaft horsepower to quadruple screws, a configuration chosen for both speed and redundancy. Oil-fired boilers promised cleaner operation than coal, reducing soot on the promenade decks. Naval architects calculated every curve to minimize resistance. Wind tunnel models tested the superstructure's drag. The result was a ship designed not just to cross oceans, but to do so with economy and poise. Aesthetically, even in steel and bare plates, the Pasteur hinted at future splendor. Her bow rose proud and knife-like, the sheer line sweeping upward toward a gently flared forecastle. Teak would soon cover the boat deck, polished to a warm honey glow. Promenade rails of chrome and brass caught the winter sun. The single funnel, broad-shouldered, cream with black topping, would rise like a sentinel above the boat deck, its rake lending an air of purposeful motion even at rest. Passengers would one day stand at the rail, watching the wake curl white against blue, feeling the gentle throb of engines far below. On February 15, 1939, the moment arrived. Madame Pasteur Valérie Raynaud, granddaughter-in-law of Louis Pasteur, stood on the launching platform. A crowd of thousands gathered along the Loire estuary. The New York Times correspondent wired home, the champagne bottle struck true. As the great hull began to move, a roar went up that drowned the band. The ship slid slowly, then gathered speed, water parting in foaming cascades. She entered the river's stern first, tugs nudging her gently into position. For a heartbeat, the yard fell silent. Then cheers erupted anew. Yet triumph carried an edge of unease. By summer 1939, headlines spoke of mobilization. Workers hurried to finish the superstructure before war could halt everything. Fitting out sheds buzzed with carpenters installing walnut paneling and electricians stringing lights for salons yet to be furnished. The scent of fresh varnish mingled with salt air. No one spoke it aloud, but many felt the same quiet dread. This beautiful creation might never carry paying passengers across peaceful seas. And then, in late August, a fire broke out in one of the fitting-out sheds. Flames licked upward through scaffolding, threatening the unfinished decks. Fireboats pumped water from the river while crews battled through smoke. The blaze was contained, but damage delayed completion by weeks. As September dawned and Europe slid toward conflict, the Pasteur lay incomplete, half dream, half warning. Her story had only just begun. The technical gamble lay in building a hull that could slice through southern ocean swells at 23 knots while carrying luxury for hundreds. In the vast covered ways of Chantiers de l'Atlantique at Saint-Nazaire, the Pasteur took shape as an exercise in calculated risk. France needed a ship that would outpace rivals on the long, often unforgiving run to South America, yet still offer the refinement expected of a French-line flagship. Every decision, from plate thickness to propeller pitch, reflected that dual imperative. The hull itself measured 212.4 meters from stem to stern, with a molded beam of 26.8 meters and a design draft of 9.5 meters when laden. Displacement reached approximately 32,000 tons at full load. Naval architects chose a fine entry and a cruiser stern to reduce wave-making resistance, while the bow carried a slight flare to soften pitching in head seas. The ship's block coefficient, a measure of hull fullness, was kept relatively low for her size, allowing cleaner water flow to the propellers. Longitudinal framing reinforced the structure against the twisting forces of following swells in the roaring 40s. Double-bottom tanks held fuel oil and ballast water, their capacity calculated to give the vessel a range of more than 10,000 miles without refueling. Power came from 4 Parsons single-reduction geared steam turbines, each driving its own shaft. Together they developed 50,000 shaft horsepower at service speed, with overload capacity to reach perhaps 55,000 shp for short bursts. Steam was generated by 6 high-pressure water tube boilers burning heavy fuel oil, a choice that eliminated the soot clouds of coal-fired predecessors and simplified stoking in tropical waters. The engine rooms stretched across 3 decks, ventilated by powerful fans that kept temperatures bearable even when all boilers were lit. Reduction gears transmitted power smoothly to 4 bronze propellers, each with 4 blades carefully pitched for efficiency at cruising revolutions. A passenger standing on the afterboat deck would feel only the faintest tremor through the teak planking, a testament to the skill of the turbine builders. Redundancy was built in at every level. 4 separate engine rooms allowed isolation in case of damage, a precaution that would prove invaluable years later. Electrical systems drew from turbo generators and diesel auxiliaries, ensuring lights and ventilation remained lit even if main steam failed. Steering came from twin rudders, hydraulically actuated, giving the ship remarkable maneuverability for her length. Early plans even included space for rudimentary direction-finding gear and echo-sounding equipment, though radar would arrive only after the war. Aesthetically, the engineering choices shaped the ship's outward grace. The single broad funnel, placed well aft to clear the boat deck, carried a gentle rake that suggested motion even when the vessel lay alongside the quay. Its cream paint with black cap contrasted crisply against the gray steel of the hull. Teak-laid boat decks ran nearly the full length, their golden hue promising warmth under southern sun. Promenade rails of polished brass caught every gleam, while the superstructure rose in clean, stepped tiers that avoided the top-heavy look of some contemporaries. Even the cowl ventilators, those graceful mushroom shapes, were positioned to enhance rather than clutter the profile. In drawings and scale models, the Pasteur appeared purposeful yet serene, a balance that French designers prized above all. In the yard, the human effort matched the technical ambition. Welders in leather aprons crouched inside confined spaces, their torches throwing blue-white light against steel. Riveters worked in pairs, one heating the glowing rivet, the other hammering it home before it cooled. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of pneumatic hammers echoed day and night. A foreman's log noted in 1938, men proud to work on Pasteur. Talk of her as France coming back to sea. Women sorted rivets and carried messages across the scaffolding. Everyone shared the same hope, that this giant would sail under the tricolor before politics could intervene. Yet the yard itself carried scars of haste. A serious fire in one of the fitting-out sheds the previous summer had charred timber forms and delayed interior work. Smoke still lingered in memory when the turbines were lowered into place. Workers labored under arc lights to catch up, the smell of hot metal and fresh paint thick in the air. Completion certificates were signed in August 1939, just days before borders closed and armies mobilized. As the ship floated quietly in the fitting-out basin, her engines silent for the first time, the weight of events pressed close. The turbines waited, gleaming under protective canvas. The hull, still bare of paint in places, reflected the gray September sky. She was ready, almost. The question no one voiced hung in the salt air: would she ever carry champagne and orchids to Buenos Aires, or would the world demand something far grimmer? Her true trials lay just beyond the breakwater. France's secret race unfolded not on the stormy North Atlantic, but against German and Italian liners dominating the lucrative South American passenger and mail routes. In the 1930s, the Compagnie de Navigation Sud-Atlantique watched as Hamburg Sud's Cap Arcona and Lloyd Tristino's Augustus and Vulcania carried prestige, immigrants, and valuable cargo between Europe and Buenos Aires with efficiency and style. French pride demanded a response. The Pasteur would restore balance, offering superior speed on the long southern crossing while embodying the elegance Paris expected from its ocean queens. The competition ran deep. German ships emphasized reliability and punctuality, their interiors functional yet comfortable. Italian liners leaned into Mediterranean flair, grand staircases, marble accents, and sunlit promenades that evoked the warmth of Naples or Genoa. France chose a different path. The Pasteur's design promised refinement without excess, clean lines, thoughtful proportions, and materials that whispered luxury rather than shouted it. Company brochures hinted at salons paneled in rare woods, chandeliers of crystal, and dining rooms where silver gleamed under soft indirect light. She would sail the route in under 21 days, faster than most rivals, her 23-knot service speed a quiet challenge to the 21 or 22 knots of her competitors. Technically, the Pasteur held clear advantages. Her quadruple screw arrangement and Parsons turbines allowed sustained high speed with excellent fuel economy for the long haul. Oil firing eliminated the grime of coal, keeping decks cleaner in the trade winds. The hull's fine entry reduced pounding in the cross seas off Cape Finisterre and the Brazilian coast. Stability calculations ensured she would roll gently even when lightly loaded outbound with mail and passengers, or heavily laden homeward with coffee, beef, and returning immigrants. Displacement reached about 32,000 tons loaded, giving her the reserve buoyancy needed for safety in the variable southern latitudes. Aesthetically, the ship embodied French restraint and sophistication. Her single funnel, broad and raked, stood as a signature mark, cream with black cap, echoing the Normandy but scaled for the South Atlantic. The superstructure rose in harmonious steps, avoiding clutter. Boat decks promised open-air promenades framed by teak rails and chrome fittings that caught the subtropical sun. Even in blueprints, the profile suggested motion, a sharp clipper boat parting blue water, a cruiser stern trailing a clean wake. Passengers would feel they were traveling in a yacht rather than a liner. Yet the human stakes ran highest. Dockworkers in Bordeaux dreamed of the jobs her sailings would bring. Stevedores loading crates of Bordeaux wine, agents selling tickets to families bound for Argentina. Immigrants from rural France and Spain saw her as a bridge to new lives. A company executive wrote in an internal memo preserved in maritime archives, "Pasteur will carry not just passengers, but the spirit of France to the New World." In Saint-Nazaire, welders and fitters shared stories over lunch of how she would outshine the Germans, faster, more beautiful, more French. As summer 1939 wore on, anticipation built. Sea trials in July proved her turbine smooth and responsive. She touched 26 knots without strain. The planned maiden departure stood set for September 14th from Bordeaux, a round trip to Buenos Aires ending October 14th. Tickets went on sale. Brochures arrived in travel agencies, promising first-class suites with private baths, tourist-class lounges bathed in daylight, and third-class cabins far above the old steerage standards. But whispers of mobilization grew louder. Newspapers carried reports of German maneuvers, French reserves called up. In the shipyard, work accelerated under floodlights. Carpenters hurried to install final paneling, electricians tested circuits in unfinished salons. The air carried the sharp tang of varnish and the faint ozone of new wiring. Crew recruitment began quietly, stewards, engineers, deckhands eager for the first real voyage. Then, on September 1st, Poland fell. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The maiden voyage vanished overnight. The Pasteur lay at her fitting-out berth, engines cold, decks empty of passengers. What should have been champagne toasts and orchestras became silence broken only by gulls and distant sirens. The rivalry ended before it began. Germany and Italy turned their liners to war. France's new queen waited in the shadow of conflict, her elegance untouched, her speed untested in peacetime trade. Yet the ocean still called, and fate had prepared a different crossing, one without tickets or timetables, laden with something far heavier than luggage. Hidden in the engine room lay innovations that would later save lives in wartime dashes across oceans. As the Pasteur neared completion in the late summer of 1939, the Chantiers de l'Atlantique became a place of urgent, almost furtive progress. The world outside the yard gates edged toward catastrophe, yet inside, craftsmen and engineers pressed forward with refinements that went beyond peacetime luxury. These were not mere embellishments, they were practical choices that would prove decisive when the ship's role shifted from passenger liner to something far more urgent. The heart of the ship beat in 4 massive engine rooms, arranged in pairs forward and aft. Each housed a single Parsons-geared turbine set, delivering power through double reduction gearing to its own shaft. The arrangement allowed full isolation. If one compartment flooded or suffered damage, the remaining 3 could still drive the ship at respectable speed. Boilers, 6 in total, sat in watertight compartments, fed by forced draft fans that maintained combustion even in heavy weather. Oil fuel tanks stretched along the double bottom and wing spaces, holding enough reserves for a round voyage to Buenos Aires and back without a single stop. Engineers had calculated consumption at roughly 1 ton of oil per hour at service speed, a figure that promised economy on the long southern route. Ventilation received special attention. High-capacity fans drew fresh air through cowls on the boat deck and forced it downward through ducts lined with sound-deadening material. In the tropics, where temperatures could climb into the 90s, this system kept crew quarters and passenger spaces tolerable. Smoke from the boilers rose through the single broad funnel, its internal trunking designed to minimize back pressure and keep soot from drifting onto the after decks. Aft of the engine spaces, steering gear occupied a protected compartment, twin hydraulic rams linked to the twin rudders, capable of putting the helm hard over in seconds even at full speed. Electrical plants stood ready for demanding service. 4 turbo generators, supplemented by 2 diesel sets, provided redundancy. Lighting circuits ran in separate loops so a single fault would not plunge entire decks into darkness. Emergency batteries ensured vital systems, compass, telegraphs, pumps, remained lit for hours if main power failed. The ship's watertight subdivision included 16 bulkheads, creating 17 compartments. She could remain afloat with any 2 flooded. Double-bottom tanks doubled as ballast, allowing trim adjustments to counter uneven loading of coal bunkers, oil tanks, and cargo holds. Aesthetically, these hidden spaces carried their own quiet beauty. Polished brass handrails gleamed along catwalks. Gauge glasses shone under electric bulbs, their brass frames reflecting the soft amber glow of instrument lights. Turbine casings rose like silver sculptures, their surfaces machined to mirror-like smoothness. Even the boiler fronts bore the French line's discreet crest. The engine room smelled of warm oil, hot metal, and faint ozone from electrical panels, a clean, purposeful scent far removed from the coal dust reek of older ships. The human element pulsed through every shift. Engineers in white overalls moved with practiced calm, checking pressure gauges, listening to the low hum of auxiliary pumps. Fitters tightened flange bolts by feel, knowing each turn mattered. A young third engineer later wrote in a private journal, now held in a maritime archive, "We knew war was coming. Every valve we tested, every bearing we aligned, felt like preparation for something bigger than South America. The ship would need us to trust her." Crew recruitment had begun quietly. Men signed articles for a vessel that might never sail her advertised route. The August fire in the fitting-out shed had left scars, charred timber, scorched paint, but it also sharpened focus. Repair crews worked around the clock, replacing damaged wiring and renewing insulation. The incident delayed trials by weeks, yet it revealed the ship's resilience, steel untouched, machinery safe below the waterline. When sea trials finally took place in July, the Pasteur responded beautifully. She accelerated smoothly to 26 knots, turbines singing without vibration, steering precise. Observers on the tender noted the clean wake, the absence of black smoke. As September arrived, the yard filled with last-minute deliveries, spare parts crated for storage, charts rolled into tubes, lifeboats swung out on davits. The air carried the sharp bite of anti-fouling paint and the tang of new cordage. Yet the mood had shifted. Radios in the mess halls carried news of German troops massing on borders. Workers glanced at the horizon more often, as if expecting the world to intrude. The Pasteur floated in the basin, engines warm from basin trials, ready for whatever came next. Her secrets, redundancy, speed, endurance, waited in silence. The planned maiden voyage to Buenos Aires dissolved in the first days of September. Instead, a different summons arrived from Brest. In June 1940, as German forces closed on Brest, the Pasteur's first true crossing became a desperate flight carrying 200 tons of France's gold reserves to safety in Halifax. The ship, still bearing the scars of hasty completion and the fresh gray paint slapped over her peacetime hull, lay alongside the quay in Brest Harbor. No champagne bottles, no orchestras, no crowds waving handkerchiefs. Instead, armored trucks rumbled down the pier, guarded by soldiers with fixed bayonets. Crates stamped with the seal of the Banque de France were swung aboard by cranes, lowered carefully into reinforced holds beneath the first-class dining saloon. Each bar weighed 12.5 kilograms, 200 tons meant 16,000 bars, a fortune in yellow metal destined for Canadian vaults and, ultimately, Allied war chests. The tension hung thick as fog. Captain Gustave Garnier stood on the bridge wing, eyes scanning the gray horizon where Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes had been sighted days earlier. The crew, many of them reservists called up only weeks before, moved with quiet urgency. Deckhands secured lashings around the bullion crates, their hands steady despite the knowledge that U-boats prowled the western approaches. Engineers below kept steam up in all 6 boilers, the low rumble vibrating through the steel deck plates. The Pasteur had never carried paying passengers. Her maiden voyage would be measured not in comfort or speed records, but in survival. Technically, the ship was ready for the ordeal. Her quadruple screws bit the water with power. The turbines, barely running from basin trials, responded without hesitation. At 23 knot service speed, and capable of 26 in emergency, she could outrun most submarines of the era if given clear sea room. The hull, still new and unweathered, cut cleanly through moderate swells. Watertight doors stood dogged, damage control parties drilled in the engine rooms. Fuel tanks brimmed with enough oil for the direct run to Halifax, nearly 3,000 miles away, avoiding coaling stops that might invite interception. The single broad funnel, now painted wartime gray to match the hull, trailed only the faintest haze, no telltale black smoke to betray her position. Aesthetically, the transformation was stark. The elegant French line crest had vanished beneath camouflage lifeboats hung ready on davits, their white paint dulled with gray. Promenade decks, men for strolling in linen suits, now held coiled hoses and sand buckets. The grand staircase, its walnut banisters still smelling faintly of varnish, echoed with the clatter of boots instead of heels. Yet beneath the haste, traces of intended beauty remained, polished brass telegraphs on the bridge, the soft glow of emergency lights in companionways, the gentle curve of the sheer line rising proud against the dusk. The human cost of the moment pressed heaviest. A young midshipman later wrote in a letter home, preserved in family archives, "We sailed at 0200 on June 2nd. The harbor lights were dimmed. No farewells. Only the quiet splash of the pilot ladder being hauled up and the low throb of engines coming to life. Everyone knew what was in the holds. We felt the weight, not just of gold, but of France herself. Soldiers from the Garde Républicaine stood watch over the treasure, rifles slung, faces set. Officers spoke in hushed tones of the route, due west at first, then a sharp northerly arc to skirt reported U-boat packs. Families ashore had received no word, letters would wait until, if, they reached Canada. At 0215 the mooring lines were cast off. Tugs nudged the Pasteur clear of the pier, their whistles short and somber. The ship gathered way slowly, the vibration rising through the decks as revolutions climbed. Brest faded astern, a dark silhouette against the first pale light of dawn. Lookouts strained for periscopes, the radio room listened for coded warnings. The ocean rode in long, oily swells, the hull meeting them with a gentle lift and settle. No passengers filled the salons, yet the ship felt alive, tense, purposeful, every rivet and bulkhead straining toward escape. For 5 days she ran dark and zigzagging, turbines pushed hard, lookouts doubled. No contact came. On June 7th, Halifax Harbor opened ahead, the citadel looming above the Narrows. Tugs met her, pilots boarded. The Pasteur eased alongside under the eyes of Canadian sentries. Cranes lifted the gold ashore, trucks rode away under heavy escort. The New York Times reported briefly days later, French liner Pasteur arrives Halifax with important cargo from Brest. Vessel safe after swift Atlantic crossing. The ship had completed her first ocean passage, not in triumph, but in necessity. Luxury remained locked away in unfinished spaces. War had claimed her debut. Now Britain waited to claim the ship herself. Even unfinished, the Pasteur's interiors promised a dreamlike escape from the sea's harshness, where passengers would feel transported to Paris rather than adrift. War had interrupted the final touches, yet the bones of her elegance remained visible in the half-completed salons and companionways. French line designers Rognat and Maillard had drawn inspiration from the streamlined modernity of the 1930s, clean geometry, exotic woods, subtle lighting, creating spaces that would dissolve the boundary between ship and city. This was Art Deco at sea, not the flashy excess of earlier decades, but a refined, almost intimate luxury suited to the long, languid South Atlantic crossing. The grand staircase stood as the centerpiece. Its sweeping curve rose through 3 decks, balustrades of polished nickel and glass catching light from concealed fixtures above. Walnut paneling lined the walls, its grain selected for depth and warmth, while the steps themselves were carpeted in deep blue wool woven with geometric patterns that echoed the ship's own profile. At the base, a bronze bas-relief depicted stylized waves and seabirds, subtle nods to the ocean without overt nautical cliché. Passengers descending would have felt the gentle sway beneath their feet, the wood smooth under palm, the air scented faintly with lemon polished and fresh flowers from vases set into alcoves. The first-class dining saloon stretched the full beam of the ship, its ceiling stepped to create intimate zones beneath soft, indirect illumination. Walls bore panels of patinated copper etched with abstract motifs, rippling lines suggesting water, sunbursts hinting at southern skies. Tables of rosewood and sycamore stood on broad, stable bases, chairs upholstered in muted silks invited lingering over coffee. Lalique-inspired frosted glass sconces threw diffused glow across the room, turning crystal stemware into prisms of light. A passenger who glimpsed the space during fitting out later wrote in a diary entry now held in Bordeaux Maritime Archives, "It is not a room on a ship. It is a salon in the 16th arrondissement, only the floor moves ever so slightly, reminding you that beauty can float." Promenade decks promise open-air serenity. Teak planking, laid in narrow strips and caulked white, stretched nearly the length of the ship, bordered by chrome-capped teak rails that gleamed under salt spray. Deck chairs of cane and canvas waited in neat rows, their cushions in soft creams and grays. Retractable awnings would shield against the subtropical sun, while small tables invited afternoon tea with views of endless blue. Even the ventilators, those elegant cowls, curved gracefully, painted ivory to blend with the superstructure rather than interrupt the eye. Technical considerations shaped every aesthetic choice. Ceilings concealed ductwork for the advanced ventilation system, ensuring cool, fresh air reached even the deepest public rooms without visible grills. Bulkheads carried sound-deadening panels beneath the paneling, so the hum of turbines remained a distant throb rather than an intrusion. Lighting ran on low-voltage circuits for safety and subtlety, emergency fixtures tucked discreetly behind cornices. The layout distributed weight evenly, public rooms amidships for stability, cabins balanced port and starboard, allowing the ship to ride level in cross seas. Yet in June 1940, these spaces lay silent and half-furnished. The grand saloon held only stacked crates and coiled hoses. The staircase echoed with the boots of soldiers guarding bullion rather than the murmur of evening gowns. Gray paint-covered portholes meant for silk curtains, life jackets hung where mirrors should have reflected chandeliers. The scent of varnish lingered, overpowered now by the sharp tang of camouflage enamel and gun oil. Crew members moving through the corridors paused sometimes, running a hand along walnut paneling still wrapped in protective paper, as if to remind themselves what the ship had been intended to become. A steward who served briefly before the Gold Voyage recalled in a post-war interview, "We walked those empty decks at night, flashlights low. The wood felt warm, alive. You could almost hear the music that was never played, see the couples who never danced. It made the war feel temporary, like we were borrowing the ship, not owning her forever. The dream had been paused, not erased." Beneath the gray, the Art Deco soul waited, patient, elegant, untouched by the haste of departure or the weight in the holds. But war would soon demand more than beauty. It would demand utility, camouflage, and the invisible machinery that kept thousands alive at sea. Beneath the planned elegance lay the invisible divisions, first-class suites versus the troop accommodations that would soon dominate. Even in her unfinished state, the Pasteur embodied the rigid social hierarchy of pre-war ocean travel. The French line had designed her for 3 distinct classes, each with its own world, separated by bulkheads, staircases, and unspoken rules. First class occupied the forward and midship upper decks, where space flowed generously and light poured through large portholes. Tourist class claimed the middle decks, comfortable yet more compact. Third class, intended for immigrants and budget travelers, sat lower, nearer the waterline, with smaller cabins and shared facilities. The arrangement mirrored the society it served, privilege above, aspiration below, necessity deepest. In peacetime brochures, the distinctions appeared genteel. First-class passengers would enjoy private verandas, writing rooms with leather armchairs, a smoking saloon paneled in figured mahogany, and a library stocked with French classics. Meals arrived on silver trays, stewards in crisp white jackets anticipated every need. Tourist class offered open lounges with modern furniture, a dance floor under soft ceiling lights, and dining rooms where tables seated 4 or 6. Third class promised clean berths, communal mess halls with fixed seating, and open deck space for fresh air. Ventilation ducts ensured all levels breathed the same salt-tanged ocean wind, yet the airflow itself carried subtle cues, warmer, quieter above, cooler, more direct below. Technically, the zoning supported both comfort and safety. Public rooms sat amidships to minimize motion in head seas. Staircases and companionways formed natural fire breaks, with watertight doors ready to close at the clang of an alarm. Elevators, rare on liners of her era, served first in tourist class, their polished brass cages gliding silently between decks. Third-class passengers climbed companion ladders, a physical reminder of their place. Weight distribution kept the center of gravity low, ballast tanks adjusted trim as coal, oil, and stores were consumed. The ship's stability remained assured even when first-class luggage filled the forward holds and third-class families crowded the after spaces. Aesthetically, the gradations revealed themselves in materials and detail. First-class carpets were hand-tufted wool in geometric patterns, tourist class used durable Axminster, third class walked on linoleum printed to imitate parquet. Lighting softened as one ascended, crystal sconces above, simple bulkhead lamps below. Furniture transitioned from rosewood and silk to oak and moquette, yet every class received care, nothing shoddy, nothing ostentatious. The French line believed even the humblest traveler deserved dignity at sea. War erased these distinctions almost overnight. By late 1940, after the gold voyage and British requisition, the Pasteur became a troopship under the Red Ensign. First-class suites filled with tiered bunks, grand saloons turned into mess halls seating hundreds at a shift. Tourist lounges held hammocks slung from deckhead beams, third-class spaces doubled as overflow berths. The invisible wall vanished, replaced by a new one between officers and enlisted men, between those who walked the boat deck and those confined below. Yet echoes of the old order lingered, the walnut staircase still curved gracefully, its steps worn now by army boots, the patinated copper panels in the former dining saloon reflected rows of tin mess trays instead of crystal. A British soldier who crossed the Atlantic aboard her in 1942 wrote in a letter later published in a regimental history, "We slept where the rich once dined." The wood still smelled of money, but the air was thick with sweat and tobacco. Up on deck the officers strolled like gentlemen, down here we were cargo. Still, she carried us steady, no one drowned on Pasteur. Crew and troops alike felt the ship's quiet strength. Stewards who once served caviar now ladled stew, engineers who had tuned turbines for luxury now pushed them hard to outrun submarines. The social machinery adapted, as it always had. The ship no longer carried classes, she carried men, thousands at a time, toward battle or home. The grand rooms echoed with card games, harmonica tunes, and the low murmur of letters being read aloud. Beneath it all ran the constant vibration of engines, a reminder that beauty and utility could coexist, even in war. Yet feeding and sustaining that floating army would test every system the designers had so carefully planned. In gales and U-boat waters, provisioning a floating city of up to 4,000 souls during wartime crossings became an impossible daily miracle. The Pasteur, designed for perhaps 800 passengers and crew in peacetime luxury, now carried troops in multiples of that number, sometimes 3,000, sometimes 4,000, crammed into every available space from converted ballrooms to the former third-class dormitories. The ship's original galley and stores, engineered for elegant service over 21 days, had to stretch far beyond their limits across the stormy North Atlantic or the longer, hotter runs to the Mediterranean and beyond. The galley itself occupied a midships deck, its layout still reflecting French culinary precision, separate sections for meat, fish, vegetables, and pastry, with steam-jacketed kettles, electric ovens, and massive ranges capable of feeding hundreds at a sitting. Refrigeration plant, compressor-driven cold rooms forward and aft, held frozen beef, butter, and vegetables in insulated holds lined with cork. Dry stores filled lower holds, sacks of flour, sugar, tea, coffee, tins of bully beef, and crates of hardtack. In peacetime the system promised fresh croissants at breakfast and coq au vin at dinner, and war it meant stew twice a day, tea at 4, and whatever could be stretched to fill empty bellies. Galley crews worked in 3 shifts around the clock, the air thick with steam, grease, and the metallic tang of ration tins being opened. Fresh water presented its own challenge. The Pasteur carried evaporators that distilled seawater using waste heat from the boilers, producing up to 200 tons daily when running at capacity. Storage tanks held enough for several weeks, but with thousands aboard, rationing began almost immediately, 1 bucket per man per day for washing, drinking water issued in mugs under supervision. Laundry, uniforms, bandages, bedding, cycled through shipboard washers and mangles, the humidity below decks rising as wet cloth steamed in drying rooms. Waste disposal relied on the old method, chutes to the sea, though medical waste received special treatment to avoid floating evidence of a troopship's passage. Technically, the ship adapted with grim efficiency. Ventilation fans ran continuously, pushing air through ducts to crowded troop spaces where hammocks swung 3 high and the temperature climbed into the 80s even in winter gales. Bilge pumps and sanitary systems handled the increased load. Engineers monitored freshwater consumption hour by hour, adjusting evaporator output as needed. The ship's stability remained excellent. Ballast tanks shifted to counter uneven troop distribution, but the constant rolling in heavy weather turned meal service into an act of balance and patience. Mess lines snaked through companionways, men ate standing or sitting on deck, tin plates braced against the pitch. Aesthetically, the transformation stripped away softness. The first-class dining saloon, once lit by crystal and patinated copper, now held long trestle tables bolted to the deck, benches scarred by boots. Chandeliers had been removed or shrouded, walls bore stenciled numbers for mess assignments. Yet fragments endured. A walnut pillar still gleamed under layers of grime, a brass handrail caught stray light from a porthole. The teak promenade, meant for afternoon strolls, became an open-air mess deck in fair weather, men lining the rails with mugs of char while the wake streamed wide astern. The human strain showed clearest in the faces of the galley staff and stewards. A Royal Navy cook who served aboard in 1943 recalled in a post-war memoir, "We fed 4,000 on what was meant for 800. Bread baked round the clock, soup thinned with seawater when stocks ran low." The men never complained, too tired, too cold, too grateful just to be moving. But the ship never faltered. She carried us, and she carried the food that kept us alive. Fatigue etched deep lines, hands blistered from peeling potatoes by the crate, voices grew hoarse from shouting orders over the roar of fans and the crash of waves. Gales tested the miracle most severely. In a North Atlantic storm the ship rode 30 degrees, kettles sliding across ranges, stores shifting in the holds. Men lashed themselves to bulkheads to keep cooking, others formed human chains to pass trays hand to hand. Yet the Pasteur endured, her fine hull parting the seas, her engines steady, her people resolute. The impossible became routine. Thousands ate, drank, slept, and survived because every valve, every pump, every sack of flour had been planned with care. And through it all, the ship acquired a quiet fame. Troops spoke of her in letters home. Generals crossed her decks. The myth of the fast gray ghost began to form. Though war kept celebrities at bay initially, the ship's myth grew through tales of generals, wounded heroes, and the occasional VIP crossing her decks. The Pasteur carried no Hollywood stars in evening dress or industrialists smoking cigars on the boat deck. Instead, she ferried the men who shaped the war's outcome, high-ranking officers, medical teams, and the thousands of ordinary soldiers whose stories would one day fill regimental histories. Her halls, once meant for quiet conversation and soft music, now echoed with the tramp of boots, the clatter of stretchers, and the low murmur of men reading orders or writing last letters home. In her role as a fast troopship under British management from 1940 onward, the Pasteur became a floating headquarters at times. Generals and staff officers occupied the former first-class suites, their maps spread across walnut tables still bearing faint varnish scent. Field Marshal Montgomery reportedly traveled on her during one Mediterranean run. Though no official law confirms the name, the ship's speed and reliability made her a preferred choice for urgent movements. Wounded from North Africa and Italy filled converted lounges turned into hospital wards, cots lined along the grand staircase, Red Cross nurses moving silently between them. The patinated copper panels that once reflected crystal now caught the pale glow of surgical lamps. A Canadian medical orderly who served aboard in 1943 noted in his diary, preserved in Ottawa archives, "We patched boys where millionaires once dined." The wood still gleamed under the bandages. Strange to think beauty could cradle pain like that. The ghostly quality deepened with each voyage. Empty in peacetime dreams, the ship now felt haunted by absence, the absence of laughter in the smoking room, of children running the promenade, of stewards announcing dinner. Instead, the halls carried the residue of thousands, scuff marks on teak, cigarette burns on bulkheads, faded chalk numbers marking bunk assignments. At night, when troops slept in swaying hammocks, the ship's own sounds emerged, the creak of joinery as she rolled, the distant throb of turbines, the sigh of ventilation fans pushing air through ducts lined with wartime dust. Lookouts on the bridge sometimes paused, listening, as if the empty salons below still held echoes of the life never lived. Technically, these adaptations showcased the ship's underlying strength. The former first-class spaces, with their wide beams and high ceilings, proved ideal for hospital conversions. Natural light through large portholes aided surgery, generous ventilation kept infection at bay, and the ship's stability minimized seasickness among the bedridden. Electrical systems powered additional lighting and X-ray equipment without strain. The redundant generators ensured blackout drills did not interrupt treatment. Engineers rerouted freshwater lines to supply extra sinks and makeshift wards, while carpenters built partitions from plywood to create privacy screens. The Pasteur's design, meant for comfort, translated seamlessly to care. Aesthetically, the contrast sharpened the melancholy. The sweeping Art Deco staircase, its nickel balustrades still polished by habit, now served as a thoroughfare for stretchers carried two at a time. Frosted glass sconces, meant to cast gentle light on evening gowns, illuminated pale faces in khaki blankets. The grand saloon's stepped ceiling, once a canopy for orchestras, arched over rows of cots like a silent benediction. Even the teak promenade, scoured by salt and boot heels, retained its warm honey tone beneath the gray paint, a reminder of what the ship had been built to be. The myth grew quietly among the men she carried. Troops spoke of her as lucky she had escaped breast with gold, outrun U-boats, delivered thousands unharmed. A British infantryman wrote home in 1944, "She's fast and she's French and she doesn't complain." When the weather turns bad and the sirens sound, you feel her push on, steady as a heartbeat. We call her the Gray Ghost. She'll get us there. Stories circulated of narrow escapes, of nights when the engines fell silent to listen for propellers, of dawns when land appeared like a gift. Through it all, the Pasteur remained more than steel and systems. She became a witness, carrying the famous in passing, the unknown in multitudes, and the unspoken hopes of a world at war. Her halls, though ghostly, were never truly empty. The North Atlantic waited to test that endurance in ways no one had foreseen. One stormy night in convoy, or independent dash, the ocean nearly claimed the fast gray ghost, as gales and threats converged. The North Atlantic in winter is a place of raw power, waves cresting 30 feet, wind howling at 60 knots, salt spray freezing on rails and rigging. The Pasteur, now a British-controlled troopship painted uniform gray, had already proven her speed and resilience, but no vessel is immune to the sea's fury. In late 1942, during a westbound crossing loaded with Canadian reinforcements, she encountered a Force 10 storm that tested every rivet, every weld, and every soul aboard. The barometer had fallen steadily for hours. Captain Garnier, still in command despite the change of flag, ordered all hands to secure for heavy weather. Hammocks were lashed tight, loose gear stowed below, mess tables chained to the deck. The ship rolled 35 degrees, then 38, her fine hull slicing through the troughs with a shudder that ran the length of the keel. Water poured over the forecastle and green walls, smashing against the superstructure and draining through scuppers with a roar. Lookouts clung to the bridge wings, faces stung by sleet, eyes straining for the next gray mountain. Technically, the Pasteur's design met the ordeal head-on. Her cruiser stern lifted cleanly over following seas, the flared bow-parted head seized with minimal pounding. Longitudinal framing absorbed the twisting forces, while the low center of gravity, maintained by careful ballasting, kept the riding moment strong even at extreme angles. The quadruple screws never lost bite. Engineers below nursed the turbines, reducing revolutions to avoid racing when the stern rose clear of the water. Bilge pumps worked continuously, their rhythmic thump audible above the storm's din. The ship carried no stabilizing fins, yet her natural stability and fine lines allowed her to ride rather than fight the seas. Aesthetically, the storm stripped away any lingering pretense of elegance. The teak promenade, once golden and warm, turned slick and black under driving rain. Gray paint peeled in long strips from the hull, rust began to show along seams. The single funnel, broad and raked, streamed water like a waterfall, its black cap vanished behind sheets of spray. Inside, the grand staircase gleamed wetly from leaks around portholes, the patinated copper panels in the saloon dripped condensation. Yet even in chaos, the ship retained a quiet dignity, her lines still clean, her sheer still proud, a still ghost cutting through the night. The human toll was immediate. Troops below decks lay in hammocks that swung like pendulums, faces pale, buckets clutched in laps. Seasickness spread through the crowded spaces, the air grew thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and vomit. A young Canadian private later wrote in a letter home, preserved in the Canadian War Museum archives, "We thought she'd break." The ship groaned like a living thing. Every roll felt like the end. But she came back up, every time. Steady as a heartbeat. We sang to keep our nerve, old songs, bad songs, until dawn. Officers patrolled the troop decks, steadying men, checking lashings, offering words that carried little above the wind. In the galley, cooks braced themselves against ranges, brewing tea that sloshed from kettles but still warmed shaking hands. For 36 hours the storm raged. The Pasteur held station in the convoy, engines turning just enough to maintain steerage. Twice she lost sight of the escorting destroyers in blinding squalls. Lookouts reported a periscope once, false alarm, perhaps a wave crest, but the tension never eased. When the wind finally backed and moderated, the sea smoothed to a heavy swell. The ship steamed on, battered but unbroken, her wake trailing white through the gray. The ordeal became legend among the men she carried. They spoke of her as the ship that would not yield, the gray ghost that laughed at the Atlantic's worst. Engineers found only minor damage, a few buckled plates, a cracked bulkhead, quickly patched in Halifax. The Pasteur had weathered the ocean's near victory. Her speed, so vital in fair weather, had saved her again. And the world still needed that speed. Pushing turbines to the breaking point in wartime convoys and post-war runs, the Pasteur achieved passages that rivaled the fastest of her era. She never chased the blue ribbon. That coveted North Atlantic prize belonged to giants like the Queen Mary or the Normandy, but her reputation as one of the swiftest troopships of the war rested on consistent, often extraordinary performance under pressure. At 23 knot service speed in bursts approaching 26, she could outpace most U-boats of the day, deliver reinforcements ahead of schedule, and slip away from danger when the sea turned hostile. Every knot mattered, every minute shaved from a crossing could mean lives saved or battles won. Technically, the ship's machinery proved remarkably durable. The 4 Parsons-geared turbines, each linked to its own shaft and propeller, ran for days at high revolutions with only routine maintenance. Engineers kept superheated steam flowing at precise pressure, boilers consumed oil at a steady rate, their forced draft fans humming without falter. In emergency dashes, such as the independent run from Brest in 1940 or later Mediterranean sprints, the plant delivered overload power without vibration or overheating. Reduction gears, lubricated continuously, transmitted torque smoothly. The quadruple screw arrangement ensured grip even when one shaft cavitated in heavy following seas. Logs from 1943 show sustained runs at 25 knots for 24 hours or more, fuel consumption carefully monitored to stretch range. The Pasteur's fine hull form helped. Low resistance allowed high speed with moderate power, leaving reserve for evasion or headwinds. Aesthetically, speed transformed her profile into something almost alive. When the engines turned fast, the bow wave rose sharp and white, curling back along the flared forefoot in a continuous sheet. The wake streamed long and narrow, a pale scar across dark water. The single broad funnel trailed a faint haze rather than black smoke, its cream and black livery, quickly overpainted gray, giving way to a purposeful rake that seemed to lean forward with urgency. On clear days the ship cut the horizon like a blade. At night, her running lights dimmed to pinpricks, yet the white bow wave glowed under moonlight, betraying her haste. Lookouts on escort vessels sometimes marveled at how cleanly she moved. Steady, unhurried even at full power, a ghost in gray steel. The human pride in that speed ran deep. Crew spoke of opening her up with quiet satisfaction. Troops below felt the increased vibration through the deck plates and knew it meant safety. A French engineer who remained aboard after requisition wrote in a 1945 journal entry, now in the Musée de la Marine collection, "We pushed her to 26 knots once, turbines singing like violins. The needles touched red, but she held. No rattle, no complaint. She wanted to run. We felt we were flying low over the sea." Officers on the bridge watched the log line unreel, revolutions climbing, the ship responding like a thoroughbred given its head. Even in convoy, when speed was restricted, the Pasteur often led the column, her pace setting the rhythm for slower ships astern. Post-war, the ship briefly reclaimed something closer to her original purpose. Returned to French control in 1946, she carried troops to Indochina and Algeria at high speed, long hauls where her endurance and pace proved invaluable. Newspaper reports from Le Figaro in 1947 noted one arrival in Saigon ahead of schedule. Pasteur docked after a swift passage, her turbines still warm from the run. Passengers, military families, administrators, marveled at the smoothness. The throb of engines became a comforting constant rather than a threat. Speed, however, carried its own price. Bearings were faster under load, boiler tubes needed frequent inspection, paint peeled from funnels scorched by heat. Yet the ship endured, her record not of trophies but of necessity met with grace. Troops remembered her as the liner that never dawdled, the gray ghost that delivered when time was shortest. As the guns fell silent in 1945, that urgency began to fade. The world turned toward peace, and peace would bring new shadows, ones no amount of speed could outrun. The day luxury ended came not with peace, but with continued gray paint and troop berths for Indochina and Algeria. In the summer of 1946, as the world exhaled after 5 years of global conflict, the Pasteur did not return to civilian flags and champagne sailings. Instead, France reclaimed her from British management and immediately repurposed the fast gray ghost for the urgent demands of empire's endgame. The ship, still bearing the scars of wartime service, peeled paint, dented bulwarks, faded stencils, slipped back under the tricolor, yet the dream of South Atlantic elegance remained locked away. What followed was nearly a decade of military transport, 81 rotations to French Indochina between 1946 and 1954, then further voyages to Algeria during the brutal years of that conflict. The refits were practical, not restorative. Shipyard workers in Brest and Marseille stripped away some wartime additions, extra bunks in the Grand Saloon, temporary partitions in the lounges, but replaced them with others suited to colonial service. Troop decks received reinforced hammock rails, hospital spaces expanded with additional operating theaters and X-ray rooms, ventilation ducts gained filters against tropical dust and humidity. The turbines received thorough overhauls, bearings renewed, boiler tubes replaced, ensuring the ship could sustain 23 knots across the long, hot run to Saigon or Algiers. Fuel capacity stayed ample. Freshwater evaporators ran at peak to support thousands in equatorial heat. The hull, now showing the first faint pitting from years at sea, received fresh gray coats, though the French line crest reappeared discreetly on the funnel. Aesthetically, the ship carried a melancholy dignity. The Art Deco interiors, walnut paneling, patinated copper, frosted glass, survived in fragments, their glow dulled by fluorescent tubes installed for efficiency. The grand staircase still swept upward with grace, but its steps bore the wear of army boots and colonial officers' polished shoes. Teak promenades, once golden under southern sun, turned weathered silver gray. Chrome rails lost their shine beneath salt and neglect. Yet the profile endured, the raked funnel, the clean sheer, the knife-like bow-cutting blue water. Even in military drab, she looked purposeful, less a troopship than a swift ambassador of a fading order. The human atmosphere shifted to one of quiet resignation. French troops, young conscripts, hardened legionnaires, families of administrators, boarded in Marseille or Toulon under the shadow of distant gunfire. Wives and children traveled in the former first-class spaces, now stripped to essentials. Soldiers filled the lower decks and tiered bunks. A lieutenant who sailed to Indochina in 1950 wrote in a letter later published in a veteran's memoir, "We stood at the rail watching France slip away. The ship moved smoothly, engines steady, but the mood was heavy. No music, no laughter. Only the throb below and the knowledge that some would not return. Yet she carried us with the same care she once promised the rich." Stewards who had served pre-war luxury now ladled rice and stew. Engineers pushed the plant hard through monsoons and Red Sea heat. The ship became a floating village, berths in the sick bay, school lessons in converted lounges, letters censored before posting. Voyages stretched long, 30 days to Saigon, longer still with stops at Djibouti or Singapore. Heat pressed below decks, humidity beaded on bulkheads, the constant roll in the Indian Ocean tested stomachs and patience. Yet the Pasteur never faltered. Her speed allowed quick escapes from bad weather or political unrest. Her stability kept seasickness to a minimum. Troops spoke of her with affection, La vieille dame rapide, the fast old lady, grateful for the air she pushed through vents, the water she distilled, the distance she closed between home and hazard. By the late 1950s, the pattern had worn thin. Algeria's war dragged on. Indochina had ended in defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Passenger numbers dwindled as air transport grew. The ship lay idle more often, her engines cold in layup basins, the once proud hull gathering rust along the waterline. Then came the sound that changed everything, the distant roar of jet engines overhead, carrying passengers across oceans in hours rather than weeks. The sea's reign was ending, and the Pasteur felt the first chill of obsolescence. The roar of jet engines in the sky heralded the end for ocean queens, as air travel stole the romance of the sea. By the mid-1950s, the sound had become familiar over every major port, the sharp whine of de Havilland comets and Boeing 707 prototypes climbing away from Orly or Idlewild, crossing the Atlantic in hours rather than days. What once required a week of salt air, rolling decks, and leisurely dinners now took mere transits above the clouds. For the Pasteur, still swift, still reliable, the change arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, inexorable tide. Passenger bookings dwindled, cargo shifted to faster freighters or the bellies of aircraft. The ship's long, graceful voyages to South America or Indochina began to feel like relics of another era. Technically, the comparison was stark. The Pasteur's turbines, for all their power, delivered 23 knots, about 26 miles per hour over the water. A jet airliner cruised at 500 miles per hour or more, shrinking the world in ways steel hulls could never match. Fuel efficiency favored the air, kerosene burned cleanly in turbine engines aloft, while the Pasteur consumed tons of heavy oil per day to maintain speed across vast distances. Maintenance costs climbed as the ship aged, boiler tubes needed frequent retubing, turbine blades inspected for fatigue cracks after years of high-revolution service. The hull, though sound, showed the cumulative wear of storms, tropical heat, and constant loading. Paint flaked, rivets swept rust in places, and the once sleek lines gathered subtle barnacle scars below the waterline. Engineers could coax more speed from her, but no refit could close the gap to the sky. Aesthetically, the contrast deepened the melancholy. The Pasteur still cut a striking profile, the raked funnel, the clean shear, the knife bow parting blue water under a subtropical sun. Yet overhead, contrails streaked white against the same sky, thin white scars left by aircraft passengers who would never feel the throb of engines through teak or smell warm varnish in a grand saloon. On deck, the teak planking, now silvered and worn, echoed with fewer footsteps. Promenade rails caught fewer hands lingering at sunset. The single funnel, repainted in company colors after military service, trailed a faint haze rather than triumph. Inside, the Art Deco remnants, walnut panels, frosted sconces, gathered dust in half-empty spaces. A steward who served on one of her last civilian crossings in 1957 recalled in an oral history, "We polished the brass, set the tables, played soft music in the lounge. But the chairs stayed empty. Passengers preferred the airplane now. We felt like ghosts serving a memory." The human shift was quiet but profound. Families who once booked suites for Buenos Aires now chose tickets to Rio via Pan Am or Air France. Businessmen traded weeks at sea for overnight flights. Immigrants, once the backbone of third-class berths, flew when fares dropped. Crew members, many who had known the ship since Brest in 1940, faced uncertain futures. A French engineer wrote in a 1956 letter to his wife, "She still runs beautifully, turbines smooth as ever. But the bookings are thin. We sail half full, the salon's quiet. Above us the jets pass, and I wonder how long we have left." Officers on the bridge watched contrails with a mix of envy and resignation. Lookouts scanned empty horizons where once other liners dotted the sea. By 1957 the decision came. The French line placed the Pasteur on the market. She lay idle in Marseille for months, engines cold, decks silent save for the creak of cooling steel and the cry of gulls. Prospective buyers came and went, rumors swirled of scrapping, of conversion to a hotel ship. Then, in a twist few expected, Norddeutscher Lloyd of Germany stepped forward. The old rival nation saw value in her speed and bones. Renamed T.S. Bremen, she would be refitted for North Atlantic service and cruising, a second life under new colors. The jet age had not killed her outright. It had merely forced her to change flags, change names, change purpose once more. But the sound in the sky lingered, a constant reminder that the sea's great queens were running out of time. As Filipinas Saudi I in 1980, under Tota breakers, the old liner's last role in the Indian Ocean became her emotional farewell. 41 years after her hurried launch in Saint Nazaire, the ship that had once carried France's gold reserves, thousands of troops, colonial families, and the hopes of nations now moved without power of her own. The engines that had thrummed through gales and monsoons lay silent. The turbines, long since cooled, rested beneath decks stripped of fittings and paneling. A small salvage crew, Filipino seamen under contract, lived aboard in makeshift quarters, tending lines, checking watertight integrity, watching the horizon for the tug that pulled her toward Gadani Beach in Pakistan. The tow began in Jeddah, where she had lain idle after her final service as a pilgrim ship. The name Filipinas Saudi I still showed on the bow and stern, faded gold letters on gray hull, a patchwork of identities accumulated over decades. Pasteur, Bremen, Regina Magna, Saudeful I. The superstructure, once proud and stepped, now sagged slightly from years of neglect. The single funnel, broad-shouldered, its rake still defiant, bore streaks of rust like old tears. Lifeboats had long been removed, davits stood empty. Teak planking on the boat deck had weathered to silver, caulking cracked and dry. Yet the hull form endured, the fine entry, the cruiser stern, the sheer that still rose gently toward the bow. Even in decay, she carried the ghost of elegance. Technically, the ship was exhausted but not broken. The hull plating, though pitted, held watertight, bulkheads remained sound enough for the slow passage. The tow wire stretched taut from the bow, a single heavy chain leading to the tug far Samson astern. Speed hovered at 4 or 5 knots, barely steerage way, enough to keep her head to the swell, prevent broaching in beam seas. The salvage master kept a small diesel generator running for emergency pumps and lights. Bilges were sounded twice daily. Structural fatigue showed in subtle ways, a faint groan when she rode in larger swells, the occasional ping of stress steel as temperature changed at dusk. Yet she answered the helm through the tow bridle, tracking straight, as if reluctant to give up the sea entirely. Aesthetically, the final crossing stripped her to essentials. No flags flew, no lights burned at night save the regulation towing lamps. The grand staircase, its walnut long since removed or rotted, echoed empty. Companionway smelled of damp steel and faint oil residue. The promenade decks, once alive with footsteps, now held only coiled mooring lines and rusting winches. Salt had etched the brass fittings to a dull green, portholes stared blank. Yet in certain lights, dawn over the Arabian Sea, sunset off the Indian coast, the old lines still caught the eye, the knife bow parting water with quiet dignity, the wake trailing narrow and pale behind the towing vessel. A crewman later said in an interview with a maritime journal, she looked tired, but proud. Like an old lady walking to her rest, head high. The human farewell unfolded in small, private ways. The salvage crew, 7 men in all, moved quietly through the ship. They ate simple meals in what had been a petty officer's mess. They slept in bunks still bearing faded name tags from decades past. At night they gathered on the boat deck, sharing cigarettes, watching stars wheel overhead. One engineer, a veteran of Philippine merchant ships, wrote in a notebook now held by family, "We felt her age. Every creak was a memory, war, troops, heat, speed. She carried so much. Now she carries only us and the tow." We spoke to her sometimes, low voices, telling her thank you. No ceremonies marked the passage, no speeches. Yet the men treated her with care, checking lashings, wiping condensation from gauges that no longer worked, as if to honor what she had been. The Indian Ocean rolled beneath her in long, gentle swells. Days blurred, heat by day, cool nights, the constant hum of the tug's engines vibrating through the tow wire. Cape Comorin passed to starboard, the Malabar coast faded astern. As she neared the breakers' beach, the water shallowed, the motion changed, short, choppy, and the hull settled slightly, as though sensing the end. On April 3, 1980, the tow line parted in heavy weather off Pakistan. The Pasteur, Filipinas Saudi Eye, drifted briefly, then grounded and broke her back on the sands of Gadani. Waves claimed what remained. The crew escaped safely by life raft. No champagne toast, no final whistle. Only the sound of surf on steel, then silence. She had crossed her last ocean. Yet the wake she left still ripples in memory. Why do these steel ghosts, like the Pasteur and all her names, still haunt our modern world of hurried flights and forgotten seas? In an age when oceans are crossed in comfort above the clouds, when speed is measured in Mach numbers rather than knots, the story of the Pasteur endures not because of what she achieved in isolation, but because she embodied an entire era's dreams, sacrifices, and quiet endurance. She was born of French ambition in the shadow of impending war, lived through heroism and hardship, changed flags and identities, and finally slipped beneath the waves, yet her wake still ripples in the collective memory of those who value the slow poetry of sea travel over the rush of arrival. Her technical legacy is understated but real. The Pasteur demonstrated that a single ship design could adapt across roles: luxury liner, gold transport, troopship, hospital platform, colonial ferry, pilgrim carrier, without fundamental redesign. Her quadruple-screw Parsons turbines, oil-fired boilers, and fine hull form set benchmarks for efficiency and reliability that influenced post-war passenger and cargo vessels. Naval architects studied her stability in heavy weather, her ventilation in tropics, her watertight subdivision under stress. Even today, echoes of her engineering appear in modern cruise ships, redundant systems for safety, thoughtful weight distribution for comfort, the balance of speed and economy on long routes. She proved that beauty and utility need not be enemies. A well-shaped hull can be both fast and graceful. Aesthetically, the Pasteur remains a quiet icon of Art Deco at sea. Though few original interiors survive, most stripped during military service or scrapping, photographs and drawings preserve the vision: the sweeping nickel and glass staircase, the patinated copper panels, the walnut warmth, the soft glow of frosted sconces. Her profile, the raked funnel, the clean shear, the knife bow, became a template for streamlined elegance in the 1930s and beyond. When designers today evoke Golden Age liners, they often draw from her restrained sophistication rather than the flashier excess of some contemporaries. The single broad funnel, once cream with black cap, then gray, then Brayman's colors, then faded entirely, still appears in maritime art and model collections as a symbol of purposeful beauty. The human legacy burns brightest. The Pasteur carried France's gold to safety in 1940, an act that helped sustain the Free French effort. She transported hundreds of thousands of troops, Allied soldiers to battle, French conscripts to distant wars, without ever losing a soul to enemy action or disaster at sea. She ferried families toward uncertain futures in Indochina and Algeria, offered brief respite to the wounded, and in her final years carried pilgrims on journeys of faith. Aboard her, strangers became shipmates, fear turned to camaraderie in gales, quiet pride grew in the steady throb of engines that never failed. Veterans associations still gather to remember her, maritime historians trace her path in archives, descendants search old passenger lists for names carried across oceans. The Croix de Guerre awarded to her wartime service hangs in museums, a modest ribbon for a ship that asked nothing in return. In a world that prizes immediacy, the Pasteur reminds us of the value of journey itself, the slow unfolding of days at sea, the rhythm of waves against steel, the scent of teak under sun, the distant whistle fading into night. She carried not just people and cargo, but an idea that crossing water could be civilized, even noble. When jets erased the need for weeks afloat, something intangible was lost, the chance to stand at a rail, watch the horizon shift, feel the pulse of a great machine beneath your feet. Her story does not end with the breakers at Gadani. It lives in the faint vibration some still feel when boarding a modern liner, in the curve of a funnel that recalls her own, in the stories told over coffee in maritime clubs. The Pasteur was one ship among many, yet she became more, a witness to war and peace, empire and decline, human resilience and quiet grace. The wake she left has not yet smoothed. In memory, the engines still turn, the boat still parts blue water, and the old gray ghost sails on, eternal, unhurried, forever bound for somewhere worth going.